All right, welcome everyone to today's Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. We're happy that you have joined us for today's session on corn tar spot. As a reminder, these sessions are brought to you by the University of Minnesota Extension and generous support from the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, as well as the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. I'm Nathan Rhodes. I will be your moderator here for today. I'm a regional extension educator out of Rochester. And with us today, we welcome Dean Malvik, who is our extension plant pathologist, as well as Darcy Talenko, who is extension plant pathologist out of Purdue. With that, I will turn it over to our speakers today. So Dean Malvik is kicking this off for us. So whenever you're ready, Dean.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. As we all know, today's topic is corn tar spot, which is something Darcy and I have been talking about extensively and has had a lot of interest here. Let's see here. Across the Midwest in the last few years, and of course, increasing in Minnesota. And this is a two-part presentation. I'm going to present kind of some of the basics about the disease, the distribution, and the current status in Minnesota. And we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Darcy Talenko from Purdue University, who's done extensive work on tar spot. And as a reminder, they've had tar spot in Indiana, about 4 years longer than we've had it here in Minnesota. So they have a little more experience dealing with it. They've been able to collect more data and more information on management trials and management information. So a little bit of background information first. I suspect a number of you have seen this disease, and certainly more of you have heard of it. But just as a reminder for those that don't know or have heard, and a little bit for those who don't know, it's caused by a fungus. Its name is Phylacera matus. Not that that is really important for most of us here, but it's an invasive disease. Again, I think you may know that. It wasn't known in the U.S. before 2015, and it didn't do much in the U.S. The first 2 years after it was found in northern Illinois and northern Indiana. But starting in 2018, it really started to spread quickly around the Midwest. And it was first found in southern Minnesota in 2019. It produces these small raised black spots on leaves and husks that you'll see in these pictures here, and you'll have a chance to see more pictures as we go along. But these spots are raised. They generally go through the leaf, both the top and the bottom, and they cannot be rubbed off, unlike dirt spots or insect frass or there's no rusty spores that come out of pustules, say on rust. Favored by wet weather and moderate temperatures. Those are some things that we do know for sure. What are the real risk factors? I think we really have more to learn about this. I think that's the main point. But if there are two key points, it seems to prefer moderate temperatures and wet conditions. Although there are other variables that we don't really understand well, I would say. It likes high humidity, extended periods of leaf wetness, and again, lots of rainfall. Those are conditions that seem to support it. But I have to say, even under those conditions, at times, the disease doesn't take off like it does at other times. Now, where is tar spot now? And this is just a reminder here. Some of you are aware of this, but again, the darkest red, maroonish counties in north central Illinois, north central Indiana, that's the area where it was first found in 2015. And as a reminder, it wasn't known outside of southern Mexico, Central America, and South America before that time. And since it was found first in these two states in 2015, it spread rapidly, as I noted, across the Midwest. It's been found in every county in Iowa, a large part of Wisconsin now, and it's certainly spreading across Minnesota. This map doesn't show every county in Minnesota. This one does. This shows where it has been found in Minnesota and confirmed. Every county that's shaded, whether it's gray or yellow, shows where tar spot has been found. And so far, the good thing has been the only area where it's been significant in terms of yield losses and high severity is the extreme southeast part of Minnesota. which is the area to the south and east of that red arced line that I put on this map. Now, most areas, with very few exceptions outside of that southeast corner, tar spot levels are very low, with leaves looking like they do here on the left. On the far left, we can see one of the tar spots, and the one slightly to the right of that, you can see maybe 20 or something. Again, not enough to cause yield loss at that point, but nonetheless was found and certainly is present in those areas and probably beyond. And again, here's a range of symptoms from low levels, again on the far left, to high levels and dead leaves on the far right. And it can move, spread and expand and develop from what it appears on the left here to the right in a period of 2 to 3 weeks under the right conditions. So this disease can really spread and really develop quickly if we have favorable conditions. And a little bit more about that. And so, folks wonder where the pathogen comes from and how we get the infection. Now, where it first came from before it was found in the US, now that's a wide open question. I think nobody has a clear answer to at this point. People have lots of ideas, but thinking about, say, the Midwest, it's certainly surviving on residue that's infected in the field right now. And when that residue warms up, it's moist, the fungus will become active, it will release spores that can then infect the new plants as they're growing in the spring, early summer. In addition, after those initial infections occur, those tar spots produce more spores that then spread and create secondary cycling of the disease. And you can see an example of that on the upper right picture, as well as in my picture on the left. You can see the older, larger stroma or dark spots, and then many, many smaller ones, which are probably a result of secondary cycling of the disease, which is when you clearly get a lot more damage occurring. So with that, I will end my comments on the basic background information. And we'll have more chance later to answer questions if we wish. So I'll turn this over to Darcy now, and she'll give her perspectives on management of tar spot and maybe some updates on Indiana if she wishes. So I will stop sharing. Darcy can take it over. Thank you.
Darcy, you're on mute.
You're unmuted.
Myself, sorry. There you go.
Thank you.
So I apologize if I not looking at you, because I've got 2 screens going, and I think I can see better if I look at my larger screen on some of our work. But again, I'm going to try to cover the management side. Dean did a good coverage of what's going on and learning about the disease. And let's see if I can get, just as a note, if you want to look at some of the information we're talking about, you can try to follow us on Twitter and updates in season on those mappings. What the maps that Dean showed, we try to utilize them here in Indiana. I tell my growers to use them to try to document when is the disease active and start scouting for it, particularly in those areas where we've seen losses. And every year, as Dean mentioned, the moisture conditions are important. In years where we have severe tar spot in northern Indiana, this is kind of the symptomology that we see. And the problem is when we have those favorable conditions, we can go from that leaf on the left where we have 5-7% of the stromata there to the leaf on the right in 2 weeks. And that's the biggest concern, due to the fact that if this happens where we're, at dough stage and the crop shuts down and we have all these leaves blighting, then we have that potential for a lot of yield loss. That being said, every year we're learning more. One problem with this pathogen is its obligate nature, and that it needs a living host to grow. And so some of the biology that we're trying to learn about is really hard because we really don't have really good tools to look at it off season in the lab and in the greenhouse. We're still working on them, especially as more and more regions develop tar spot and we got more and more scientists working on it. But what we learn is year to year implications of that. And so this last season, I would say in Indiana from 2018 through 2021, we had significant losses in some fields, 20 to 60 bushels per acre. 2018 was a severe epidemic. We continue to build the inoculum around the region. And then 2020, we had those favorable conditions where we had some fields in Indiana that 50% loss. So this disease does have the potential, once you have the inoculum on your farm, to really lead to significant losses if you have those favorable environmental conditions. And I just want to emphasize, those conditions are really important. We can find tar spot throughout. We have it in 86 of our 92 counties, but in general, it's not impacting yield as much in central and southern Indiana as it is in northern Indiana. But again, we have pockets that pop up if they're along rivers or lakes where they have those high moisture conditions. So that's just something to note as we look at managing the disease. So in my mind, you should try to manage tar spot if you really know it's on your farm and going to cause yield impacts. So that southeast corner of Minnesota, you're the ones that may need to be watching it more. If you're not in those regions that are favorable, just be aware of it and be ready to react if the season changes. Okay, so this is an example of my tar spot site in Indiana, where we try to run different research trials, and you can see that there are some treatments that are allowing us to keep the crop canopy clean and not blighted by disease. And so some of that is, first, we wanted to look at an integrated program. Could we identify tolerant lines? Hybrids are more resistant to the disease versus susceptible. And if we can identify tolerant lines, will that eliminate the need for adding a fungicide? And so this is kind of a summary of those last 3 years of data where we had significant disease from 19 to 21. So we identified 2 tolerant lines, and then we compared them to our susceptible. And you can see where we haven't treated with fungicides, so the black bars, we can significantly reduce the amount of stromata, the severity of the disease in the crop canopy by just using tolerance. And then if we add that additional fungicide, so we went with our standard BTR1 application, again, we can, in a susceptible line, we reduce disease significantly. But in our tolerant lines overall, we may not see that significant bump down of disease, and then that's going to change the yield impacts. And that's the important thing, is how are we protecting yield? Will we get the return on investment if we're adding these fungicides to our programs? And so then, see if I get this to move right. So if we look at the yield, so there's variability, and that's what I've been pushing our industry for. Is not we weren't breeding for tar spot tolerance until this 2018 epidemic. It became on the radar for U.S. hybrids. But I've been pushing industry to try to identify those hybrids that may have tolerance. The problem is they're lagging in yield potential. So sometimes you might have a susceptible line that may get a lot of disease, but still out yields a tolerant line. So that's kind of what we're seeing here is, yes, our susceptible line is a lot less disease than that tolerant one, but maybe not as much yield loss as compared to tolerant 2. So the idea is we can identify hybrids that have tolerance, but do they get us the yield potential that we want? And then overall, we do see that adding a fungicide will protect us if we're under an environment with severe tar spot, and give us that significant yield boost for that. So that's just one angle. We want to look at an integration program. We don't want to solely rely on our fungicides, but until we get really good hybrids for our region that have resistance, fungicides are an option. And so we've been running these multi-state trials. I'm sure Dean is going to be putting out trials as he moves forward and gets more inoculum in areas where he can do this research for Minnesota. But we've been running these trials where we've had significant tar spot across the region. And the one thing I want to show is the limitation of our fungicides. And so if you think about our fungicides, they're all designed to have a 2 to 3, maybe 4 week activity period. And if you think about, depending where tar spot starts in the season, we may need more than that 3-week period of protection. If we have the disease start in early July, that gives us more than a couple months that we need to protect against the disease compared to if the disease starts in September. And this is just a graph that I like to show on the impact of our fungicides and what the goal is. And so here, if we look in 2020, tar spot we found on the 28th of July at this research site. We put our applications out at August 7th at BTR1. I kind of show they have a window of activity of 3 to 4 weeks. Our disease development in a year where it's favorable for tar spot, we get that exponential increase once we reach that R2, R3 stage, where the disease develops in the canopy. When we add our fungicides, the goal was to shift that curve off, like push the disease off. But once those fungicides run out of their activity, we've shifted the disease curve down. But again, when they're beyond that activity period, then the disease, as long as there's green tissue to infect in favorable conditions, can ramp back up in the crop canopy. So that's just important to understand that our fungicides will give us some yield protection, but You may not see it if you went out and looked at your field 6 weeks later after that application, because the disease has that potential to move back in that canopy. And so this is kind of in our research sites, the rapid development I kind of showed earlier in our untreated. The problem with tar spot is you can't just do a drive-by scouting of this disease. So in the picture on the left, both my untreated plots, there's about 5% tar spot in there with those black stromata. 2 weeks later, in a favorable condition, these are what our plots generally look like in those years where we've had those conditions. The disease started mid-July. And so by the end of September, we have blighted corn, and we're hoping that it would stay green at least another month. And so if we look at some of our fungicide trials, and we've done this multiple years, I'm just going to share a few. This is looking at that severe epidemic where we had trials across Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ontario, Canada. The severity level was over 25%. And when I get to the stromata at 25% of that ear leaf, that's when those leaves are are blighting and turning what I call a chocolate color. So there's really too much disease there to control. But you can see generally, if you can have pick a choice of products, all the products significantly reduce tar spot. I think some of the separation we're starting to see is more on the longevity of those products in the canopy. Some of them, like Lucento, may be not quite as long as the Veltima or Revitec in being in that crop canopy. So that's kind of, I think you have a choice of products. If we look at the yield potential across those environments, in general, if you look at the numbers, 207 bushels per acre on our non-treated, and some of our lower 214. So we're 7 bushels to almost 20 bushels on average across these locations. In general, what we saw is, fungicides are providing 3% or more yield protection with that 17 to 18 bushel protection. And then those 3 products are providing 15 to 18 bushels above the untreated. So that would be the Delaro Complete, Veltima, and Revitec. So in general, you can see the return on investment for using a fungicide is there. If you protect 7 bushels, you probably pay for that fungicide. And we continue to have questions, especially as we learn more about this disease. So in 21, the disease started earlier. And so we had a lot of questions in Indiana on, well, do I need a 2-application program? And if I go with a 2-application program, should I start with a heavy hitter up front? And then can I put a generic in there? Or should I flip-flop and start with a generic, keep the disease low, and then follow with a heavier, more expensive program? And so that's kind of what we laid out to run in 2022. So we started with our top products, just 1 application of VTR1. Then we had that program plus a 3-week later treatment with Headline Amp. And since Headline Amp is going off label, and then we flip-flopped it. So it's a Headline Amp starting, and then followed by those other products 3 weeks later. This year, 2022 was a low severity year for most of the region that's been impacted by tar spot. But I think this trial shows an importance of timing on controlling this disease. And so if we look at the results of the severity that occurred by the end of the season, if you look at that, those yellow bars where we had that single application at VTR1, they're not different from our non-treated control. So what happened there? They went out, but the disease didn't start later. So we didn't even find disease in 2022 until like the end of August, September. So those programs where we added that 3-week later application after that VT application, as you can see, all significantly reduced disease over the untreated control. And so this is something that's important to think about, is we need to be there protecting the crop canopy when the disease is active. And for this season, the activity didn't really start till the end of the season. But again, looking at these numbers, the previous slide where I was looking at efficacy, we were over 25%. And here our severity was less than 2 across the region. So I think it's really important to understand your risk. Is the inoculum on your farm? Do you have the environmental conditions that are going to be conducive for the disease? And then think about how the season is progressing to make an informed decision if a fungicide will be necessary. And so then, because we had low disease pressure, no yield differences between all these programs. So again, this year, we didn't get the return on investment for putting a fungicide out because the environmental conditions were not favorable for tar spot. And if I look backwards, and I don't have all that charts in this talk today, in June and July in Indiana, we were hot and dry. And like Dean shared, moderate temperatures, wet conditions, we didn't have those to initiate the disease, and it really slowed down the pathogen. So we escaped this year without significant yield losses. That being said, we still have the inoculum here for 2023, and I wish I could predict what the weather is going to look like for the future. So as we talk about fungicide efficacy, we have a really good resource that we put together with the Crop Protection Network that gives us efficacy on the major products that are used in corn. And you can cross-reference that if gray leaf spot's a problem on your farm or northern corn leaf blight, you can cross-reference these and try to identify the products that may work the best for you. So that's a really good resource. We just released the update for 2023. So again, I recommend using that as a tool to try to identify what you want to use on your farm. And so timing is another thing we keep trying to figure out and looking for management of tar spot here in Indiana. And so what we did is we picked two products. So we picked a Veltima and Lucento. So Veltima will be purple and Lucento green, and looked at just the stage timing at different at growth stages when would we apply the product. So again, we started with a V8 application timing as if the disease started earlier. Do we want to go those late vegetative timings? We do our standard VT timing and then an R3 application timing. And then we also threw in, as soon as we find the disease in the lower canopy in this field, then we trigger, yes, we're going to spray for fungicide. And then we added the 3-week later program. So we compared these multiple programs for the last 3 years on managing tar spot in Indiana. And so it's pretty interesting because each year it's going to change which program worked the best. So back, if we look at 2020, it was a moderately, we started off slow. The disease didn't come in till late July. But you can see here, which was really exciting for me, is we can, if we know we have the disease, maybe we can make an informed decision that if we find it in the lower canopy, we then can, yes, trigger a fungicide application for that season. So you can see if you look at these, first detection, VT were my best timings for both products. There's a little difference between the product efficacy, but again, those were the best both timings. Actually, Lucento had an R3 that wasn't too different. But also, if you look at it where we had the double program, where we started at late vegetative, followed by 3 weeks later, we didn't add anything then. So in 2020, one well-timed fungicide application at the VT to R1 stage got us the protection we needed from tar spot for limiting the disease in the canopy. If we switch and then go to 2021, so this year, the disease, instead of starting at the end of July, we first found it at the beginning of July. So that July 3rd weekend, we had a lot of rain at the end of May and early in June that really kicked the disease up early. My best timing here is that V8 followed by 3 weeks later, because the disease started there. This is the 1 year where that late vegetative followed by 3 weeks later really had an impact of getting the best protection across the crop canopy. So, and that worked for both products. And then if we switch gears for 2022, I want to note that my y-axis has changed significantly, where it was up to 700 in the previous 2 years. We're down to 40 in 2022. But again, if we look at the best control timing, first detection still hung in there and it went out of the VT. So we still got relatively good control versus adding 2 applications. We really don't add anything by putting that fungicide out. And I want us to be stewards and use our fungicides as needed when necessary, but not adding too much to the system. And then the next question comes in on the yield potential. And so if we look at those years across this experiment, really 2021 was the only experiment year where we really saw a significant increase in yield. And in those trials, that double application program got us 18 to 30% yield protection, which would have paid for those 2 applications of fungicide. And so that comes to the next things that we're trying to determine and looking at the net returns from using fungicides and their timing. And so we have summarized the last 3 years, or 19 to 21 data, where we had severe history and disease pressure. So we can compare what happens when you have a field that's under severe pressure as compared to a field where we have low to no disease. And I think this is just a proof of concept of the importance of understanding what pathogen you're trying to tackle and control. So with tar spot, what does that result in? And so prior to tar spot impacting yield, there was a big meta-analysis done that looked at the comparison of using a fungicide in hybrid corn and whether you got a yield difference or yield boost for using that fungicide, not really considering whether the diseases were present or not. So in general, we have about 70% where there was a positive yield change. If we look at the values of those, a V6 application netted about 2 bushels per acre. A VT application, 6 bushels per acre, and that combination V6 plus VT is about 7.9 bushels per acre. But this is prior to where we had tar spot as one of our disease factors as we were looking at. So if we switch and look at tar spot, so again, we separated our locations by a high and low. And so in our high location, we have 20% or more tar spot. It gets severe symptoms. We have the severe blighting that occurs. And we had 2 different trials running in the low and high situations. We had our efficacy trials and then our timing trials. And so that's what we wanted to compare is what is the net return if we use these fungicides. And so if we look at all the different products that we have available that we evaluated over those last 3 years, and we split them out by high and low disease pressure. So the low disease pressure are the green bars and the high disease pressure are the white bars. And that's, yield response. So in general, every fungicide applied in a high disease situation resulted in a positive net yield response, except for Proline, which we were mainly looking at that one for just if the mode of action, it is not really labeled for corn. So we wouldn't use that anyways. But in general, on average, we saw about 9.5 bushels per acre yield response by using a fungicide under a high tar spot situation. If we compare that to our low situation, we have fluctuations in that yield response. And on average, we saw about a 3 bushel per acre yield response, and it ranged from -7 to 11. So again, in general, proof of concept, high tar spot pressure, we get a good yield response. That'll give us, the net returns. If we then look at timings to try to identify our best timings, this project was all using Trivapro because back in 2018, that was the only product initially that had a full label for tar spot. And so when we looked at this timings, we ranged from starting at V6 all the way up to R5. And you can see there, the best timings in our high disease situation was, VT tassel, which we talk about our standard timing for corn, and then also that R2 and R3 stages. So those are the ones that popped out as best. We don't really add anything with that V6, VTR1. Again, those years that VTR1 was the heavy hitter of that program. But you can see again, generally on the high situation, we're getting about 14 bushels on average yield increase. Whereas the low situation and with Trivapro, we had a -2.7. And so then what we did is we took this information and then calculated the cost of the different fungicides based on, surveying some of our growers and consultants here in Indiana. And what we found, if we take out the cost of that fungicide application, whether it's aerial or ground, on average, where we had high severe tar spot pressure, we would get a net return of $29 to $48 per acre. Whereas where we don't have that low disease pressure, it can be a loss of 25 to a gain of $1.06. Again, more proof of concept, where we have that high risk for tar spot, fungicide will give us the protection we need to give us the return on investment for putting a fungicide out. And so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about, we know it survives other residue. We know it survives at least 1 year. I suspect it's longer. We're still working on identifying tools to help us evaluate that. But there's been many questions on residue management and how that may influence tar spot. So we have this multi-state work going on where we're comparing high residue situations to low residue situations, not only for tar spots, but for some of our other major diseases in corn. This data is looking at just 5 locations where we had 7 field trials. And we compared a high residue situation to a low residue situation, and then also whether we had a resistant or susceptible hybrid planted. And so the first thing we can see is, yes, we can see if we have reduced our residue, we can significantly reduce tar spot severity slightly across all those locations when we average it. I think it's starting off, the disease takes a little bit longer to start in the canopy because it doesn't have as much inoculum there as compared to a high residue situation. If we look at resistance, again, where we have resistance, we again significantly reduce disease. When we layer those together, though, if we look at this lower corner, high residue resistance, high residue susceptible versus low residue resistance, low residue susceptible, where we get the best yield, disease reduction is using a resistant hybrid versus the step down from residue to low residue is not as much. And so I think that's really important to understand that, again, we got to push to using hybrids. The other side of that is this is just looking some initial fields. When we have that secondary inoculum moving through the Midwest, it's not really going to matter some of those cultural practices, residue management, rotation in your field, because the neighbor field or the neighboring county or the neighboring state, those spores can then still move in. And if we have unfavorable conditions, we still might see tar spot develop. So that was my one cautionary note on looking at residue and rotation, is the limitation because of the secondary cycle nature of this pathogen. The other thing we are noting is we might find tar spot early and late vegetative stages, but we really see it kick in as we approach that R3 milk to dough stage, and then explodes in R5 and R6 when we have favorable conditions. So there is still a plant pathogen interaction going on crop maturity as well that triggers the pathogen to really infect those leaves as it moves along the season and try to reproduce and create those secondary cycles. So some of my recommendations for tar spot, again, assess your risk. Is it in your fields? Know it's in the region, and be aware you got to be out and scouting for it. Talk about hybrid resistance. I know companies are slowly getting data together where they have some rankings on hybrid resistance that may be available. If you're looking at fungicides, mixed modes of action is what we recommend, but timing may be critical. But we have these maps, and the Tar Spotter app to help us try to figure out where the disease is starting, and then if the favorable conditions need to occur. Irrigation, we're still trying to figure out here in Indiana. We have a couple projects moving forward on how we try to limit the wetting events for promoting disease. And then I'm crossing off rotation or residue management. I think it's less effective because of the secondary nature of the cycle, that once the disease is starting through the region, we have spores moving throughout the Midwest. And I think that's all I have. Some other references and information are available on Crop Protection Network. We have a tar spot book that has tools that can help you scout and determine severity levels or other information as well. And I think that's all I have. So I've got time now. Questions.
Awesome. Well, that was a great presentation. Thank you. That's a lot of information to take in a very short period of time.
If anybody needs those slides or wants some of that, just let me know. I think that's available.
Okay, good. Well, actually, that was one of our questions, as where can they find a copy of some of those slides, especially your work on some of the fungicide timings and, based off of some of the disease presence and by year.
Yep. So I will share it with them, and you can share it with others. I'll get you the PowerPoint, and I'm going to warn you, it probably has an hour worth of talk. I'll give you everything that I've shared with our growers.
Awesome. I guess we'll start with the live questions here. So for those who have questions, again, feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom there. If you have questions, please put those in and we'll start working through those. We'll get through as many as we can. And those that are left, we'll get you information later. So starting with Greg, he was wondering, Darcy, this question came in with your slide, with one of your slides where you showed corn tar spot leaves. He's asked the question, is leaf on the left, is that already too late to treat? And so I guess in this case here, what level of severity are we going for with tar spot that we need to treat?
So we haven't quite identified when I'm going to say no spray, but I'm going to tell you that leaf on the left, if that's the ear leaf and above, it's game over in that crop canopy. I didn't get into that. If we look at that leaf, that stromata there, if you think about it, that's the fruiting body of the fungus. It's getting ready to release the secondary spores. So if we think about it, it already gained access. It's been in the leaf feeding on that material, and now it's coming up to reproduce. So I would say, and I've been in fields where they've sprayed multiple times and they went in too late and we don't change the disease pressure. So it's really important to understand if, first of all, is the disease on your farm, and scout that lower canopy. I think you can find it relatively early if you're out there watching for it. Scout that lower canopy to make a decision to protect that upper canopy. But that's why we also have these tools. So if you see me, my team's out there, they got eagle eyes on finding one or two stromata, tar spot, and we turn on that map. That says, yes, we've had conducive conditions. The disease is active. And the problem is those stroma probably take 15 to 21 days to see that first lesion. So it's already gained access. We're still trying to dig back through now we got more and more data. We can go backwards and say, where do we fail? And I didn't show some of that timing work. But when we went out with R4 and R5 applications, there was no change in that disease curve. It was too late. So sometimes you could be too early and you miss that window like I showed in 2022. But I would rather have the protection out there at that VTR1 timing if you know it's going to be a problem versus going in too late and not controlling it at all. So then you're just wasting product again. Long answer, I guess.
Yeah, I can add a couple of comments to that. And that is Jose Solorzano, graduate student working here at the University of Minnesota, collected some plants from a field that had just a few lesions at the, I think, first part of September. And he took them to our greenhouse where we had no tar spot. He washed the leaves so to remove any potential spores that were sitting on the surface. And then lesions kept developing for 2 or 3 weeks. So the infection was already there. And that's partly what Darcy is alluding to. And these fungicides are not really very good at stopping or killing the infection that's already there and started. So we need to get the fungicide there before those infections start, and we don't see them initially.
Okay, well, moving on here. So next question actually looks like it's a question on some of the last slides you had there, Darcy. The impact of crop rotation on disease incidence. I know you mentioned that maybe we shouldn't necessarily be relying on that. Is there strategies for some of our organic growers who maybe don't have access to fungicides that there's some benefit that might help them out?
I think initially, if it's on your farm, the problem, so if I'm looking at Indiana rotation, generally it's corn, soybeans every year and some continuous corn. The problem, I guess you can try to reduce that initial inoculum. If we don't have the host, we could reduce it. But the problem is we didn't get into the cycle as much. We have that initial infection, which we can try to delay, but those secondary infections, and you've seen this map where we're blowing across the United States, those spores are moving. And so if they move early, and I guess so that's watch the maps. If we're moving early, then we have spores moving all throughout the season that we may not be able to control it if the spore lands in an environment that can really take off in. We are looking at, we do have some organic trials out there to try to evaluate some of the products that might be available for our organic growers. But then I'm going to tell them the thing they got to push is to identify hybrids with resistance. And that's what I'm hoping 10 years from now, we're going to have a conversation as we breed it out, because we are showing that some of these hybrids can really significantly reduce disease pressure in their field. So rotation may help initially, but I think more push towards identifying your hybrids or varieties that you want to use that have less resistance. The problem is we haven't been breeding for it here in the United States. And so we may have to take a bit to get that there.
Yeah, I'll add 2 comments to that too. One is I've heard numerous reports from Southeast Minnesota with high levels of tar spot on land that was in a mixture of alfalfa and grass for several years before the corn was planted. It's hard to make sense out of that, but nonetheless, there seems to be something going on there. And the second, I guess that was the main point. The other is that in Minnesota too, we have hybrids certainly that are much less susceptible than others. And some of the companies have identified some that report look very good. And as Darcy said, there's been very little time to really do deliberate breeding for this disease. But now that the companies have identified hybrids, they can look at that genetic background and really use their molecular marker breeding platform to move that quickly forward. So I think we're all very optimistic there'll be a lot more resistance available in a few years.
Bounce around a little bit here. Another question on residue management. Does burning seem to have any effect on the incidence?
We haven't done that, but so I'm going to say the one thing, if we think about it, we did some of that spore survival residue work, and there are millions of spores coming off of a milligram of sample, right? So even if we did some residue burning, which I don't know if that's going to be an environmental option, even if just a few survive and those spores eject, we're inoculating that lower canopy. So the question is, I don't know if we can get everything to limit the amount of disease that pressure could there, but again, we're still new and exploring how to best manage these culturally. But I guess it comes back to, though, if you do something perfect on your farm to limit the spore movement, I'm still worried that the neighbors or whatever, it didn't matter. It starts there and then it blows over. And I've seen it. So I've been on fields where we first were finding tar spot where there was no residue you could see. It had been soybeans. They hadn't had tar spot, but it had to have been on that farm previous years and they just never saw it. And so that's just something to understand, that it's surviving more than a longer term than we know right now.
Okay. Do triazoles provide longer protection? So they's asking specifically about tetraconazole.
I'd have to go look at those specifically. And the problem is a lot of our products are now mixed modes of action, and teasing them apart is getting more difficult. And I would just say I wouldn't pick one because we're going to push resistance in any of them. And right now, monitoring fungicide resistance is going to be really difficult in this pathosystem.
Yeah, I'll just say as a general rule, all triazoles are not going to be effective. Tilt, for example, propiconazole is not terribly effective. It does suppress tar spot, but it's not one of the better products alone.
Does early maturing hybrids such as Minnesota have a lesser chance of genetic control?
We're trying to answer that the other way around. Can we get to early maturity, using early maturity, early planting to escape? Because we know the disease is going to come in September. We're going to have disease.
Yeah.
So the question is, can we escape that by getting the crop finished before that? I still don't have all those answers. That's what I'm working with our agronomists the last couple of years. But there's the potential if you're, in my mind, escaping when the disease pressure is really high, especially if the disease doesn't start till August or whatever, depending when the disease starts.
Okay. I guess another question there, and particularly from our years where we have a particularly high risk of tar spot, is it, and we see that come in, say, July, or even in some cases like last year in Southeast Minnesota, a little bit later in June, would early planting really help us there at that point?
I'll just speak for Minnesota. The disease, even in Minnesota, didn't take off until late. It's matching the pattern here that Darcy's reporting from Indiana. Typically we're not seeing high levels until after mid-August, often late August or even early September. So the pattern generally holds the same.
And so I think because of that as well, we have a time. It's not, if we find it early enough, you have time to make a decision if we're early enough in the season to make a decision if you want to implement another management tactic.
Yeah,
Okay.
we've seen cases too where we've seen it fairly early in July in Minnesota because the conditions were not right and favorable and never really developed the high levels.
And so we're trying to use that app, and we'll be version 4 this year because we just added a dry conditions that we didn't have previously to help better predict it. So that's what I would use that app as more as a tool of the conditions have been conducive to promote disease or not. And we're trying to build that out. We're trying to trap spores now to correlate back to the app as well. So we're working on it. It just takes time to build the data set to really hone in on those conditions that will be conducive for triggering a management tactic.
Okay, kind of hanging back on those hybrid interactions here. Are we looking at possible fungicide by hybrid interactions with these different genetic traits?
So it's going to depend on, what that hybrid provides, I guess. And I can kind of see in some of our tolerant hybrids, we can see a switch off where maybe a fungicide may have given them that additional boost in the yield protection. But right now there's variability on the yield potential in those hybrids. So I didn't show that data for this year. If we looked at some of that hybrid by timing interaction, actually my susceptible line out yielded the resistant line, right? Under low disease pressure, and it might flip flop in the other year, but sometimes like that was showing there was variability of whether we got the yield potential of the hybrid. We're still trying to dig that out. We started with a low hanging fruit of how do we best manage this disease? And hopefully over time, we continue to build and do an integrated program of where we're adding the optimum ways to manage it, not only using fungicides, but hybrids. And maybe down the line, we'll figure out there are ways we can rotate and manage other things. Managing irrigation is a big one here in Indiana as well.
Okay, we actually had a comment here looking at the late stage reproductive susceptibility of these hybrids. And so in this case here, I guess when we're looking at how do we manage this stuff over the long term, what are our best options going late into that season? Because especially here in Minnesota, I mean, we can only push planting so far back. What do you think would be our best answers to getting into September and August and September, where that disease severity is going to be greatest? How do we manage for that?
Ooh, I don't know. So I guess my one thing is that the pathogen's designed to survive, right? It's going to want to survive and it's going to push these structures. And we see that it's in there. It's going to start producing inoculum to survive. I think we can't manage that aspect of this pathogen at this point in time. It's here, it's going to be here, and it's going to continue to build in these new areas. We just have to figure out how do we best reduce the yield impacts that could come, I think. And changing planting date may not work, right? It may be some other things. And there's a lot of questions we still don't know. Just, I think it's important to understand, is it on your farm? Have you really seen a severe impact? Because it may be on your farm and it may be what cosmetically there. Maybe it won't be a problem this year, but over time, and we've seen this in pockets in Indiana, that it's been there multiple years and then they have the right conditions. And so that's the big key when we talk about the disease triangle. The host is there, the pathogen's now present here in the Midwest. What are our environmental conditions that are going to push the disease? And are they going to occur at the timeline that's going to make the disease start earlier, so we have multiple cycles occurring through the season? Or is it going to push it off where we only have a few cycles that we can minimize that yield impact? But really, it's too late to try to keep it out from your farm. It's going to be moving across the United States because of the nature of the spores moving in that secondary cycle.
Yeah, one more comment about that. I guess I think this is part of your question there, Nathan. This back to the early maturing hybrid, a short relative maturity hybrid. It would be really, I think that would be something we need to explore more. We have the opportunity to use those. Some of those are relatively actually quite high yielding in some of the yield trial. I'd be interested in looking at how that might perform, if we really did shorten up that season and have it mature, a week or two earlier. It might make a difference some years.
And I guess I could also add, let's diversify, right? Let's have a range of different things going on. So it's not every acreage is hit with the same problem. Yeah. We diversify the farm with different hybrids and planting dates and things like that to reduce the risk, I guess.
Yeah.
How do we, I guess another portion of this question is in terms of fungicide timings. And I know in our area down here in the southeast corner of the state, we saw some in-furrow applications of fungicides, and then more of almost getting closer to a 3-pass system in some instances. How do we decide what is the best course of action throughout the year, and especially with fungicide timing, because it looks like we're in for another rough year this year, at least in our area. How do we make those decisions as we go along with that fungicide timing?
I was going to say, so part of it, we can give you the optimum timings of what we see in our research when we can go whenever we can versus what works best on your farm. And I know guys in Indiana run into problems when the airplanes come in and they make a call and they want it this week and it won't happen for 3 weeks later. So there's that flexibility. We got to be for our work in Indiana, I would say between VT and R3 would be the optimal if we had to go one time. And I would rather have you pick one well-timed protection window than trying to go out extra early or extra late to see if you can capture that control. Because I want to come backwards and just remind you that we got to monitor. We don't want to be putting out too much products for fungicide resistance, and we got to be stewards of that, or we'll lose. We only have a set of products, and and we see this in frog eye and soybeans. And I just don't want to push that. I want us to use one well-timed application. And then you can look at those other, and I guess my question is tar spot the one problem, or are you looking at, do you have other disease risks that you got to manage? So if we go up into Ontario, Canada, they have a lot of problems with gibberella. And so they don't want to switch their timing because they want to protect and spray at the silking timing to protect against, vomitoxin development. So that's the other thing you need to assess is what is the concern on my field by field? What is the major concern? And then make it adaptations to that. I don't think there's a one size fits all problem, even though we want one or answer to this. There isn't one.
Yeah. Another comment. As far as Minnesota, we're fortunate. We don't have a lot of leaf disease most years.
Okay, so well, that's,
Tar spot. I mean, occasionally we see some gray leaf spot coming in, and periodically we have high levels of northern corn leaf blight, but that's not every year. So our target, most cases now where we have tar spot is going to be tar spot. And so the other thing I want to bring up is the question has come up. Folks have asked about Xyway, and have you tested that in a tar spot environment to say how well it might work? I've seen data for gray leaf spot and northern corn leaf blight suggesting that it can be effective for those late season leaf diseases, but I'm not sure about tar spot.
and so I actually just had a conversation last night with some colleagues as well. And I went and pulled data. So I just looked at this data yesterday for our severe 2021 epidemic. And what we're seeing is Xyway is really good for those other diseases, but it's not providing that middle to upper protection as we move into the tar spot. I think it's gone. We see some efficacy in the lower canopy where it's reducing disease there, but and that's early on where we've shut it down a little bit and we still have activity of Xyway, but I'm seeing not quite as much efficacy later in the season for Xyway. Where I would tell my growers is if they're having a problem with everything else and then want to delay that tar spot application or may not add it, Xyway could be an option to push you to that point, and then you make the decision if the season's been favorable to add that second foliar application. Is kind of where I think that's going to land in how we best use Xyway for tar spot, at least here in Indiana. Maybe with the little shorter growing season there in Minnesota, it might provide that, but generally, other than I just heard that there's some new changes to the label, but in general, tar spot and southern rust aren't on the Xyway label, or they weren't last year. I think there's changes. I haven't seen the new label.
Something else that kind of comes along with this is the timing of all this. So Ryan here asks, if you only find a couple of infected leaves, should you spray the whole field with fungicide, and how fast are we looking at it spreading? So if I've got a field that's relatively new, I've got a couple of spores, what are the concerns that that's going to spread throughout that field in a single season versus it taking some time to progress throughout the field?
So I guess my first question back is, have you seen it, the severe level that we've seen, that we show those pictures where we have severe infection, or have you always had just a few lesions there? And then secondly, look at the weather and what has the weather conditions been? Are you seeing the forecast is going to be wet and cool versus a hot and dry? If we're going hot and dry, we shut this down like we shut it down last year. It shut down. So and I wish I had that crystal ball because I could make a lot of money to predicting what the weather is going to do tomorrow if I could do better at it. But this last season really showed us that hot and dry June, and it continued. We had drought conditions through August in our hot tar or areas where we have high inoculum of tar spot. And I got less than 1% disease in our plots at the end of the season, even September, October, when it's usually coming out. But again, you got to make an assessment on your farm of what have you seen, understanding that, if you start seeing areas where we're squawking or Dean is saying we found it early and it's blowing up, then we need to think about, yes, we might need to control it. Again, it's not going to be a one size fits all answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We've seen a number of fields in Minnesota too, where it's been found early and it didn't really develop until much later. So fungicide would have been put on last year, say one field where it was found the very first week of July. It wouldn't have been providing much protection when the disease really took off 6 weeks later in that area.
Okay, we're coming up on time here. Again, if you have questions, get them in here and we'll try to get as many of these answered. Something that's a little bit closer to home here, the dairy side of things. Does President tar spot cause harm if we're feeding infected silage?
I don't think we know the answer to that. I suspect the answer is no, but what do you say, Art Darcy?
So in my mind, I don't think we're going to see no. We're going to see no on feeding issues, but what we see the problem is if you have it, the dry down issue and the packing of your silage is going to be more of the problem. I would say Wisconsin's got some more data on the silage work and they're working on it, but we haven't seen any. I would say so. It's not producing a toxin that we know of, like fusarium would be, or vomitoxin. So I don't think we're going to see that problem, but it's more on the nutritional value of the crop may drop dramatically if it comes in and dries it down and takes away some of that value that we're looking for. I don't get much dairy work here in Indiana, even though I come from a dairy farm. So
All right, looking at some soil health. So you talked about burying crop residue. So we're going to jump back a little bit here. This one of the last questions here is really interesting and interacts a little bit with another question we received where we're looking at cover crops and their impacts on this disease. Are we concerned about the ability of tar spot to overwinter in some of our cover crops? And then how does that influence what we need to be doing, looking at residue management potentially, especially for those, again, going back to those organic systems where we do have some organic farms that are dealing with this?
do you want that, Dean, or you want me to?
I'll start and give you a perspective. We don't have a lot of answers on that yet. That's the short answer. We have found tar spot, the disease tar spot, on grasses that are not corn, but that may not and likely isn't the same tar spot that infects corn, although that still needs to be finalized and concluded. So we know that a disease called tar spot can infect grasses, and that's been known in the Midwest for decades. But there are different kinds of tar spot fungi that don't cross between hosts. We're still trying to kind of figure that out.
Right. Well, so my answer would be, if you look in the literature, there's 900 Phyllocara species based on hosts, where they talk about that's not, as we delve into this, we're finding out that there's not that many. They may be not as different, but in general, there was lots of grass species that never moved to corn until, if they're related, they don't go to corn, they go back and forth between the different species. I'm trying to think what the other part of so we really haven't had the chance to explore cover crop relationships to helping the system. I'm going to say, we talk about residue management, but I'm not telling you to plow your fields. Keep with your soil health programs that you're working on. Just understand that when we try something in the system, it may shift the disease pressures of something else or cause other issues that we then need to think about how we better manage it with that, but protecting the soil health structure and then of that field. So we're just trying to give you the, some of the classic ways of trying to manage disease is residue management, but that's not what we're saying we're doing, especially since we know the spores are moving. And that's my thing is rotation and tillage really aren't going to help us because of the secondary nature, that it's not going to matter what you do in your field when the spores are moving, it's going to move in from other fields next door, or counties or states.
Mhm.
So.
All right, as we come up onto the time here, anything else, any final words of wisdom for people who are trying to manage this for this year?
Well, I'm gonna say there are tools available, and we're both trying to keep an eye on what's going on in our states. So if you find tar spot, I'm gonna say send it to Dean, and it'll help us try to determine what's going on in the state, share the information. So the maps, the apps, and the app, tools are available to try to help us predict what's going to happen. But again, I wish I could tell you what's going to happen this spring. So planting and everything else would be easier, but we really don't know those environmental conditions. I tell my growers, though, if you hear that I'm out of West Lafayette, Central Indiana, and we find tar spot early, something's changed, because that's not normally where we find it. So again, it's just understanding where it's active in season and when it comes along. And so last year, I had, I don't know how many questions because it didn't come in so late. Well, we're not finding it. And it's end of August before we find it. So they didn't need to control it, but after response from 21, we had a lot of fungicides go out that probably could have been held on to for other years. So
yeah, well, as far as Minnesota, I've emphasized the southeast part of the state is where the risk and the problem has been greatest, but I don't think there's any reason to think that it's going to be limited to that, especially if we have more normal wetter summer conditions, unlike we've had the last couple of years. We've had very dry conditions across a big swath of central Minnesota the last few years, 2 years especially. If that increases to normal rainfall, we could really expand the range of significant levels of tar spot. The other point I want to make is that the map showed the counties where we've gotten samples and confirmed it. I think it's very likely it's spread beyond that. We just haven't detected it yet.
And so I want samples. I was gonna say, so I want samples from those counties and states that don't have it. We want those samples to help us document it. So I would say send them into Dean or whoever if you find it on your farm, and if you find something new, let us know too. That's what our job is, right?
Yeah, if you find it, you suspect it, send a sample to me. There's no charge. I'll diagnose tar spot for free. We'd like to know where it is.
All right. Well, thank you, Darcy and Dean, for being with us here today. And thanks to everyone who's on the webinar here today and attending this episode of the Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program here today. Again, there will be a very short 3-minute question survey. We would ask that you please go ahead and take a minute to provide us feedback on today's session, as that would be greatly appreciated. We do take that quite seriously, and so we want that information. Thanks again to our sponsors, the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, as well as the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council, for providing us and sponsoring this here today.